Oh, you couldn't hear me. Now you can hear me. Welcome back to the Rhetoric Prof stream. Here on Super Bowl Sunday, doing some stuff on logic. We're going to read this piece. This is still blacklight reading hour, which I finally got an actual blacklight, but it's too early in the day for that to be visible. So this is natural light reading hour with the natural lights of our reasoning. Not really. That's not actually what Percy is going to talk about. And this is not a paper that probably is going to be super exciting to many people in the world. It's a little bit old, as you can tell from the fact that even the PDF is yellowed. It's nice when they keep that feature there. Let me see if I can get my app situation going. So this is like not just a random thing where okay. And it deals with a fair bit of like a kind of cranky guy talking about math and science from old times. But at the same time, I would say that this piece, at least a few lines in it, profoundly changed the way I think. And not only that, it is a helpful introduction to some of the basic concepts of logic in a way that I'm sure there are more accessible introductions to some of these basic concepts, but there might be reasons why sometimes you go with things that are not as easy because they have other virtues, other values to it that you wouldn't get otherwise. Also, I just kind of like this piece. So before we get into it, if you're here, welcome to the stream. Feel free to drop in the comments any questions or thoughts or ideas you have about the reading or about anything else. Who do you think is going to win the Super Bowl? If you're American, or if you're not American, you're like, why do Americans care about this? Okay. Let me pull up. I'm actually using the PDF reader for once. Let me just make sure that this it fits in. I fit it in there. I always have struggled with the aspect ratio parts of streaming. And I haven't really ever figured out a way to do it in a way that other streamers seem to not have aspect ratio problems. But I just also don't bother to think about it other than the minute right before I do it. So hopefully you can see all these things that I'm about to read. But Charles Sanders Peirce, that's the guy who this is from. This is from a magazine, the Popular Science Monthly, and he was publishing a bunch of these little papers on science and logic and philosophy, I guess, to a public. Is it Popular Science Monthly? Popular Science still exists as a magazine. I think it's the same magazine. I don't think they call it monthly anymore. Maybe I don't know if it comes out monthly. So it's still around. Today it's very different. Like this level of stuff, this would not appear like a piece of popular writing anymore. This would be a little bit too much, but probably. But these papers, even though they were like his popular writing, some of his most important writing comes out in some of these places where he's writing to popular audiences because he's notoriously, people are interested in this guy. And a surprising number of people are, given how difficult he is to read or find or understand. He constantly keeps changing the meanings of his own terms. Like every paper, he'll invoke a new vocabulary term, and he'll keep changing the meanings of the things. Some of his favorite concepts are things like firstness, secondness, and thirdness. You're like, what the hell is that? And you have to read a whole bunch of things. And he's like, also, I'm not going to use those terms anymore. So he can be a very frustrating person to read. Apparently was kind of cranky. He was, in some sense, the founder of a school of American philosophy called pragmatism, though that was another term he changed somewhere in his life where he got pissed off about other people using this term, namely William James. He was like, actually, it's pragmaticism now. So he's kind of this cranky guy. But he was, in many ways, a genius. He kind of, I think it's fair to call him that in the sense that he made contributions to math, science, logic, philosophy, so many different fields to the point that they weren't even recognized until later on when people could understand what the hell he was talking about. In some sense, he invented modern logic, many things that are identified with modern logic on his own, separately from the people who are usually thought to be the founders of it. Frege and Russell, he kind of did it in his own way. And this was only discovered, I think, later. I don't know the history of all this stuff super well. But he was a guy who was interested in trying to think about, he was very impacted both by Darwin's theory of evolution. He thought that this was like a huge, I mean, it was, but he thought this was like a huge transformation in the way that we'd have to think about everything. And he was a huge proponent, at one point, of Hegel's dialectic. And those don't seem like things that obviously go together. So he was trying to kind of reckon with all this stuff that were important insights for him from German philosophy with the advances in biological thinking and also physical thinking that came with things like Maxwell's equations. So it's going to be pretty sciencey. It is illustrations of the logic of science, but it's also stuff that goes beyond science, because for Peirce, he doesn't think that there's an absolute distinction between the kinds of thinking that we do in science and the kinds of thinking that we do any other time. And that's something that's a kind of commitment in his work that makes him a really fascinating person to read now, because I think that we tend now today to think about science as something that's kind of outside of our lives. It's really important. It shapes our lives. It gives us technology. It gives us ways of thinking about the world. In some ways, you know, like some things feel more or less scientific. But for him, science was not a kind of separate enterprise from any kind of inquiry. It was it was a particular moment of that inquiry, maybe you could say. I don't know. He says a lot of different things about it. So let's get into it. This is the 6th paper in this series. Also, notice that he's part of the Coast Survey here. He was doing these like weird things with geodesy, which is like not a science I know much about, but okay, let's get into it. The chief business of the logician is to classify arguments. Well, there you go. See about that? This is also, I'm teaching this in my argument course, so this might be explain why I'm doing this today. For all testing clearly depends on classification. I wonder why he says that. All testing clearly depends on classification. But I guess it's kind of like the thing of, if you're trying to run a test of something, like in a lab, and the things are mislabeled, like, you know, you're screwed. So you kind of need to know what things are in order to kind of go about testing them. He's going to talk a lot about classification as one of the things that is important for how to think about inferences. And welcome to the stream, by the way. The classes of the logicians are defined by certain typical forms called syllogisms. And here he doesn't mean like classes of logicians like the upper class logicians and the low class. He means the classes that logicians invented for themselves. And they invented all these kinds of arguments as kinds of syllogisms. And syllogisms are like, sometimes they feel like syllogisms. You're like, why are we talking about this? Arguments in the real world don't look like this. But his point is going to be exactly that. That's actually is going to be his point. They're going to spend a lot of time talking about syllogisms. For example, the syllogism called Barbara is as follows. S is M, M is P, hence S is P. Or to put words for letters, Enoch and Elijah were men. All men die. Hence, Enoch and Elijah must have died. And so why exactly does he choose these names is kind of funny, because it'll come up later, which is in the Bible, these are two figures in the Bible that may or may not have died. Like Elijah kind of goes away on a fiery chariot into the sky, so he's picking a limit case for a reason. They'll come up, be a little clearer later on. The is P of the logician stands for any verb, active or neuter, and is capable of strict proof, with which, however, I will not trouble the reader. He does this a few times. He's like, I won't bother proving this to you because, you know, it's boring. That all arguments, whatever, can be put into this form. So you can put everything into Barbara. Why is it called Barbara? Well, we're not going to go into all of the reasons why, but this is a medieval classification of various kinds of syllogisms. And it has to do, not exclusively, but mostly with the vowels. So A, E, I, O are the vowels of there's one called celerent, there's one called barocco, and they tell you, the vowel tells you what kind of premise you're dealing with. A is affirmative, universal. All something is something. So Barbara has all three of its propositions are like this. Okay, you don't have to know this stuff in order to read this piece, but this would be familiar to some people. And still today, some people use these classifications. They're mnemonic devices that in the Middle Ages, you had to remember a lot of stuff in your head. So if you had all these kinds of little devices, it would tell you how to move from one kind of syllogism to another and what they were and stuff. So it wasn't just to classify them. It was like little ways of thinking that allowed you to do things logically. But we're not going to learn that because it's way more complicated than is necessary if you live in a digital culture. So we did that part. But only under the condition that the is shall mean is for the purposes of the argument, or is represented by. Thus, an induction will appear in this form something like, these beans are 2/3 white. But the beans in this bag are represented by these beans. The beans in the bags are 2/3 white. So what is he talking about? These beans. We're going to talk a lot about beans. He is from Boston, Beantown. Maybe that's why he loves beans so much. Imagine you have a handful of beans. We don't know how we ended up in this world. And we first appear in the world and we have beans in our hands. But you just gotta follow along. For the purpose of argument, if I have in my hands 2/3 white beans, and I just pulled them out of the bag that I'm talking about, but the bag is kind of dark, I can't see inside of it, I'd be like, oh, probably. This is a very simple idea, right? The sample of beans in my hands represents what's in the bag. So the bag is also like this. It's 2/3 white. Sample, population. Okay. But because all inference may be reduced, if that doesn't make sense, you're here in the chat, so why not use it? Let me know, and we can talk about whatever you think about beans, all of your bean thoughts. But because all inference may be reduced in some way to Barbara, it does not follow that this is the most appropriate form in which to represent every kind of inference. We can put every inference into a specific syllogistic form, but that's just like, why would we do that? On the contrary, to show the distinctive characters of different forms of certain sorts of inference, they must clearly be exhibited in different forms peculiar to each. Barbara particularly typifies deductive reasoning. And so long as the is taken literally, no inductive reasoning can be put into this form. Because if we go back to the beans thing, right? The sample in my hand is actually not literally how the bag is composed. It's only probably that way. So you can put it in a deductive form, but you kind of have lost something. You've lost how probability works. So maybe it's not worth doing that. That's kind of what he's talking about there, I think. Barbara is, in fact, nothing but the application of a rule. The so-called major premise lays down the rule, as, for example, all men are mortal. The other or minor premise states a case under the rule, as Enoch was a man. I like how he uses Enoch rather than Socrates. Usually they use Socrates for this. I don't know why. Logicians are not necessarily known to be the most creative people. That's not necessarily fair, but they tend to use the same examples over and over again. But he's at least added a different name in here, Enoch, rather than Socrates. The conclusion applies the rule to the case and states the result. Enoch is mortal. All deduction is of this character. It is merely the application of general rules to particular cases. Sometimes this is not very evident, as in the following. All quadrangles are figures, but no triangle is a quadrangle. Therefore, some figures are not triangles. Fascinating. But here the reasoning really is this. Rule. Every quadrangle is other than a triangle. Case. Some figures are quadrangles. Quadrangles mean rectangles. Okay. Not exactly, but close enough. Result. Some figures are not triangles. Right. Okay. So if you have 3 angles or 4 angles, you're 2 different things. But some things have 4 angles, so some things are not triangles. That's how we could say it. Inductive or synthetic reasoning, being something more than the mere application of a general rule to a particular case, can never be reduced to this form. So this idea of synthetic reasoning has been pretty important in the history of logic. Sometimes the difference is made between analytic reasoning and synthetic reasoning. Like it just follows from, or this is how people often think about it. Some people don't say this. There's an interesting paper by Quine called Two Dogmas of Empiricism, where he argues that there is no such thing as an analytic statement. But it simply follows from knowing what a quadrangle is, that it has four angles or 4 sides. That's just what it is. Whereas synthetic is a kind of idea or a claim about it that requires knowing something more than just what it is. It's not just doesn't follow from its definition. It's not something that kind of immediately follows. And deduction is mostly that. It's analytical thinking. It simply follows from knowing what things are. It follows from the premises. But other kinds of thinking, even though you can put it into that form once you have all of the stuff done, it doesn't really show you how you get to that kind of inference. So inductive or synthetic reasoning, being something more than the mere application of a general rule to a particular case, can never be reduced to this form. If from a bag of beans, back to the beans, of which we know that 2/3 are white, we take one at random, it is a deductive inference that this bean is probably white, the probability being 2/3. So rather than having a handful of beans, now we're just picking one. What are the chances that this bean is going to be 2/3? What are the chances on the Vegas odds that the Eagles are going to win today? I think Vegas line has it above. Well, that might be a slightly different kind of probability because nobody knows what's in the bag yet. It's in the future. So we have different kinds of probabilities. But here it's like I can open up the bag. I can literally count every single bean. And I can be like, there's black and white beans in this bag. 2/3 of them white. Then I put all the beans back in the bag, and then I can say with certainty the probability that I will draw a white bean is 2/3. Oh wait, certainty can be probable, right? We have in fact the following syllogism. Rule: the beans in this bag are 2/3 white. Case: this bean has been drawn in such a way that in the long run the relative number of white beans so drawn would be equal to the relative number in the bag. Result: this bean has been drawn in such a way that in the long run it would turn out white 2/3 of the time. Because, and you can do this with a coin flip, right? Like if you ever done the thing maybe in math class where you flip a coin, and the odds of heads and tails are 50-50, it doesn't immediately turn out that way. In fact, it's probably, I'm not a whiz of probability. If it immediately turned out to be 50-50, that's probably the less probable thing. Only with a certain number of flips will it kind of approach that probability. You might have like 4 runs of heads in a row. And it would be wrong to immediately be like, oh, this must be a false coin. Something must be wrong with it. No, it's like there's nothing weird about there being 4 heads in a row. It's like you just got to keep doing it. If instead of drawing one bean, we draw a handful at random and conclude that 2/3 of the handful are probably white, the reasoning is of the same sort. If, however, not knowing what proportion of white beans there are in the bag, we draw a handful of random, and finding 2/3 of the bean in a handful are white, conclude that about 2/3 in the bag are white, we are rowing up the current of deductive sequence and are concluding a rule from the observation of a result in a certain case. So rather than doing the weird thing, which is only possible in very artificial situations of, let me first look at the entire sample, sorry, not the entire sample, the entire population. Let me look at every bean in the bag first, and then let me do a drawing from it. Well, why would I even bother doing that? It's totally weird and artificial. Much more likely is I'd be in a situation where I'd take my handful, and then I'd look at my handful of beans. What a beautiful handful of beans. And I would say, oh, it's 2/3 white. And then I just conclude from that the rule is that in the bag, it's also like that. It's the same. That's induction. I'm inferring the rule. I'm inferring the rule. I'm not operating from the rule. The rule is not the premise now. The rule itself is the conclusion, which is kind of cool way to think about what's going on. So he takes this and he's like, we can flip it around. These beans were in this bag. These beans were in this bag. These beans are white. So if I draw out from a bag and every bean in my hand is white, and I'm like, oh, I got it from the bag, so then all the beans in the bag are white. And so then we can put it in the deductive syllogism form. All the beans in the bags were white. But if we begin it this way, that's the thing that we wanted to figure out. So we can represent things deductively, but that doesn't really show how we got there. And so what's the importance of this? Was that many people have approached logic to be like, logic is all about certainty. Logic is about the things that you do that are absolutely true no matter what else happens. And you can put every logical inference, he's kind of conceding this, you can put every logical inference into that form, into this form that makes it absolutely certain. He's like, but that is weird to do that in many cases that are actually about, he's thinking mostly about scientific kinds of work, but he's going to give other weird examples that are just about like looking around at the world and life. Most of the time we don't know what the rule is. We don't know which rule applies. When we're doing induction, that's what we're trying to figure out. Well, what rule applies to this? That's what we're trying to figure out. So the induction is the inference of the rule from the case and the result. Now these words, the word result here I found is particularly tricky in understanding this piece. I don't know what a better one would be to call it. I really don't, but I know that can be kind of he made a confusing choice here when he called this the result. But alas, hopefully it'll become clear as we go why he calls it the result. Rule and case seem to me like fairly, I can grasp what he means by that. The rule is the rule, all beans in the bag, right? Case, these beans were in the bag. The result, yeah, I don't really know why he chooses that term. That feels weird to me, but it's purse again. But this is not the only way of inverting a deductive syllogism so as to produce a synthetic inference. And again, synthetic is the opposite of analytic, so it's like, oh, you can move back and forth. Deductive is analytic, we could say, kind of, sort of. Suppose I enter a room and there find a number of bags containing different kinds of beans. I love this like weird fever dream he's having where they're just beans everywhere. There's so many beans. Okay, so now we're in this room. There's so many different kinds of beans in lots of different bags. On the table, there's a handful of white beans. And after some searching, I find one of the bags contains white beans only. I'm like, oh my God, where are these beans? Where are these white beans coming from? I want some of these white beans. I'm going to have a beautiful garbanzo later on. And I want these beans. So I need more of them. I need more than this handful. So let me find the bag. And then I at once infer a probability, or as a fair guess, that this handful was taken out of that bag. There's a little pile of white beans. And then the other bags, there's lots of bags. So let's say one bag has in it, it's all red beans. Another bag has like a mixture of white and black beans. And one bag has only white beans. I'm like, well, it's not from the red bag. And I'm like, it's probably not from the white and black beans, because why would someone go through and pull out only the white ones, like Jennifer Lopez only wanting the black M&Ms from her people in her trailer? Like, no, I only want the brown ones. All the other ones are weird. Why doesn't chocolate look like chocolate or whatever? There's some weird thing. Why would anyone do that unless they had Jennifer Lopez telling them to do it? So, no, probably that handful of beans came from the white bag. But that's a hypothesis. So, it is the inference of a case from a rule and a result. We have then rule. All the beans from this bag are white. I looked at the bag. There are other bags, but I looked at this one. These beans are from this bag. Result, these beans are white. That's the deduction form, right? But that's not how I got there. Let's read the hypothesis. He should put this first because this is the one how we actually got there. All the beans from this bag are white, and these beans are white. And then the case is these beans are from this bag. So hypothesis infers the case. The relationship between the kind of terms of the rule and the terms of the result. Maybe it might not always work to call the result something like the sample or the observation. I don't really know what else to do. You call it. I just find it to be confusing. Okay. So, and you can put them in any order, and it's always, these are all valid, but this is the one that we actually use to get there. We accordingly classify all inference as follows. So there's inference. Then you can divide it into analytic inference, deductive or analytic inference, or synthetic inference. But synthetic inference is going to have two types. Induction, that's where you infer the rule, and hypothesis, which is where you infer the case. Okay. Yeah. Deduction, you infer the result. It just kind of follows from the rule in the case, right? You're just applying the rule to a case. Induction is where we generalize from a number of cases of which something is true and infer that the same thing is true of a whole class. So it's probable. Or where we find a certain thing to be true of a certain proportion of cases and infer that it is true of the same proportion of the whole class. Be like, Phil, I was just having this argument with my friends ahead of time. They're like, oh, we're not rooting for the Eagles because Philadelphia fans, we just forgot how bad they are. And I'm like, well, what if I'm a Philadelphia fan? It's like, well, Philadelphia fans, for the most part, are evil and terrible. So we want to see them lose. Because when I went to the game, my friend was like, when I was at the Knicks game, they were chanting, "Go Eagles, go Eagles." He's like, that's so obnoxious. That's how Philadelphia's fans are. It would be weird if only the people at the Knicks games were like that, and all the other Philadelphia fans were like very, very relaxed and chill. And they're like, well, may the best team win. So that might be a kind of induction, where you take some properties from the case and you apply that to the whole class, Philadelphia fans. Hypothesis is where we find some very curious circumstance, which would be explained by the supposition that it was a case of a certain general rule, and thereupon adopt that supposition. And he's going to give some weird examples. I'll give you some weird examples that I have, too. One time I was walking on a bridge, and this was in Pittsburgh, and there was a cyclone fence next to it. And in the cyclone fence was a ball that was stuck there. But it was weird because it wasn't like a normal ball, and it was spray painted gold. And it was in this kind of and I was like, I looked around, I was like, could it have been stuck here? Could someone have batted it up from a baseball bat and it gotten stuck? But I was like, but it's on the inside of the fence. So that doesn't make any sense. You couldn't have gone from that direction, which would be under the bridge. You would have to be on the bridge. I'm like, well, why would someone be on a bridge and a ball be stuck in the fence? It'd be very hard to play like baseball. So someone intentionally stuck it here. I was like, maybe they were playing Quidditch, like a kind of scavenger hunt thing. And this is supposed to be the golden snitch. And so I assumed that would explain this kind of anomalous, weird case. if that was, if that was the rule that would explain it. That if you were playing Quidditch as an adult who doesn't have anything better to do, as a scavenger hunt, you might take a golden ball and intentionally stick it in a fence. Then it wouldn't be weird anymore to find it that way. Or where we find that in certain respects, two objects have a strong resemblance and infer that they resemble one another strongly in other respects. So here's his weird example. I once landed at a seaport in a Turkish province. And I was walking up to the house which I was to visit. I met a man upon horseback, surrounded by 4 horsemen holding a canopy over his head. As the governor of the province was the only personage I could think of who would be so greatly honored, I inferred that this was he. So he's like, if there's a rule that something like a governor of a province would have this, retinue of horse people with canopies over him, then that would explain that what this guy is. That's the case. So he's inferring that is the case. This was an hypothesis. Fossils are found, say remains like those of fishes, but far in the interior of the country. This used to really freak people out before the famous guy who kind of helped make geology more modern. His name was Charles Lyell. There's lots of really interesting work about this kind of early geological thinking about fossils and stuff. Because people thought the world was, some people do, of course, still think the world is very young world creationists, they sometimes call some of these people. But a lot of serious scientific research also, though it was influenced in Europe, especially by the Bible, supposed the world was pretty young. So when they were finding fossils that were kind of far away from land, they're like, oh, maybe it's the flood, like Noah's flood and stuff. So that was a big explanation. They're like, oh, it was from Noah's flood. So to explain this phenomenon, we suppose the sea once washed over this land. This is another hypothesis. So, that might be compatible with Noah's flood. So you could have someone be like, oh yeah, see that's what explains it. You'd be like, yeah, the sea washed over the land, but way, way earlier than you think. We'd need another kind of hypothesis to do that. Numberless documents and monuments refer to a conqueror called Napoleon Bonaparte. Though we have not seen the man, speak for yourself, buddy. Yet we cannot explain what we have seen, namely all these documents and monuments, without supposing that he really existed. Hypothesis again. Be like, that's weird to call that a hypothesis. Isn't that a fact? And he's like, well, how we infer that it's true is the same kind of reasoning that we would do with the weird bean example of there's all these statues of Napoleon around, everyone's talking about him. It would be very odd for someone to have gone through, just as it would be way weirder for someone to go through a bag of beans and pick out all the white ones and make a little pile of white ones if there was a bag of white beans right next to him. It seems very weird that everyone would have conspired to create the false image of Napoleon if he didn't actually exist. Why would people do that? It seems just much harder to believe. So that's what gives that hypothesis strength. As a general rule, hypothesis is a weak kind of argument. It often inclines our judgment so slightly towards its conclusion that we cannot say that we believe the latter to be true. So we might hypothesize something without even believing it. We only surmise that it may be so. We think of okay, well, if that were the case, that would make sense, but I'm not sure that it is. I might have more doubt than I have belief. But there is no difference except one of degree between such an inference and that by which we are led to believe that we remember the occurrence of yesterday from our feeling as if we did so. So here he's kind of putting forward something that I think is very interesting. Hypothesis is the weakest of the different forms of inference in terms of how much conviction we would give to it naturally. Deduction, it's certain. Induction, not certain, not probable, but there's a lot of evidence for it. Hypothesis, there may not be a lot of evidence for it at all. At the same time, very obviously, if you see from the examples that he's giving, that even just believing that yesterday occurred is a hypothetical argument. It's hypothesis is by far the kind of argument and inference that we make the most frequently. We're constantly making hypothetical arguments with ourselves. Our whole kind of world is full of hypotheses. So even though hypothesis may not be the strongest kind of argument, it's the most informative, it's the most interesting, it's the one that we deal with the most. So putting everything back into the form of deductive inference, though that can sometimes be clarifying, may not be the most helpful or accurate when we're dealing with the kinds of arguments that we mostly encounter. Besides the way just pointed out of inverting a deductive syllogism to produce an induction or hypothesis, there is another. If from the truth of a certain premise, the truth of a certain conclusion would necessarily follow, then from the falsity of the conclusion, the falsity of the premise would follow. Thus take the following syllogism in Barbara. All men are mortal. Enoch and Elijah were men. Enoch and Elijah were mortal. Okay. Now a person who denies this result, be like, I don't think Enoch and Elijah were mortal. The Bible says. Someone who denies this result may admit the rule. And in this case, he must deny the case. So be like, I agree that all men are mortal, but I don't agree that Enoch and Elijah were mortal. So therefore, Enoch and Elijah were not mortal. All men are mortal, which means Enoch and Elijah were not men. This kind of syllogism is called Baroque. And interestingly enough, one of the theories about where the term Baroque came from is from the syllogism. That's actually not the popular theory, but I find it to be interesting. Though there's something about Baroque culture that the denial, the kind of negative conclusion of a particular, which seems like a very not particularly useful thing, being like, this particular thing didn't happen. This particular thing is not the case. That's kind of the usual one. That's something about Baroque culture. I find that to be interesting. On the other hand, the person who denies the result may admit the case. In that case, he must deny the rule. Thus, Enoch and Elijah were not mortal. Enoch and Elijah were men. Therefore, we have to deny the rule. Some men are not mortal. So we kind of see where our argument goes based on, you can't deny you can deny some things and keep other things, but then you're in a kind of different position, like a different kind of proposition will result. I can't be like, all men are mortal, and Enoch and Elijah did not die, and they are men. I can't say all of those things and keep within logical inferential sense, at least in this system of logic. Baroque and Boccardo are, of course, deductive syllogisms, but of a very peculiar kind. They're called by logicians indirect moods because they need some transformation to appear as the application of a rule to a particular case. But if instead of sitting out as we have here done with a necessary deduction in Barbara, we take a probable deduction of a similar form, the indirect moods we shall obtain will be corresponding to Baroque and hypothesis, corresponding to Boccardo and induction. For example, let us begin with this probable deduction in Barbara. Most of the beans in this bag are white. This handful of beans are from this bag. Probably, so the result is, therefore, probably most of this handful of beans are white. Now deny the result, but accept the rule. Few beans of this handful are white. The rule, most beans in this bag are white. Probably these beans were taken from another bag. No, there's nothing particularly weird about that kind of thing. Why would you want to put that back in Barbara? Leave Barbara alone. Hashtag leave Barbara alone. This is a hypothetical inference. Next, deny the result, but accept the case. Few beans of this handful are white. Case, these beans came from this bag. And then denial of the rule. Probably few beans in the bag are white. This is an induction. So even though we have inferred a denial of a rule here, that's its own kind of rule. Yeah. The denial of a rule is a rule. The relation thus exhibited between synthetic and deductive reasoning is not without its importance. When we adopt a certain hypothesis, it is not alone because it will explain the observed facts, but also because the contrary hypothesis would probably lead to results contrary to those observed. So when we make an induction, it is drawn not only because it explains the distribution of characters in the sample, but also because a different rule would probably have led to the sample being other than it is. But the advantage of this way of considering the subject might easily be overrated. An induction is really the inference of a rule, and to consider as the denial of a rule is an artificial conception, only admissible because when statistical or proportional propositions are considered as rules, the denial of a rule is itself a rule. So an hypothesis is really a subsumption of a case under a class and not the denial of it, except for this, that to deny a subsumption under one class is to admit a subsumption under another. So if I were going around and looking at people in the Turkish seaport, like he was saying earlier, and I was like, well, that guy can't be the governor because he doesn't have a retinue of horses around him. It's like kind of weird to do it that way. It would be like we wouldn't normally need a hypothesis there. We wouldn't need to kind of bring something under the kind of class of normal stuff that's happening. We would just kind of assume that. But Boccardo may be considered as an induction, so timid as to lose its ampliative character entirely. Amplifiative character. I wonder why that F is intentional or not. I feel like we don't use that I. We've changed the form of that word now, but maybe it means something else than I thought it meant. Enoch and Elijah are specimens of a certain kind of men. All that kind of men are shown by these instances to be immortal. But instead of boldly concluding that all very pious men, or all men favorites of the Almighty, etc., are immortal, we refrain from specifying the description of men, and rest in the merely explicative inference that some men are immortal. You're like, I don't know what makes people immortal, but some people don't die, like Elijah. Enoch and Elijah are not mortal. Now we might boldly suppose them to be gods or something of that sort, but instead of that, we limit ourselves to the inference that they are of some nature different than that man. We kind of let it be fuzzy. But after all, there is an immense difference between the relation of Barocco and Baccardo to Barbara and that of induction and hypothesis to deduction. Barocco and Baccardo are based upon the fact that if the truth of a conclusion necessarily follows from the truth of a premise, then the falsity of the premise follows from the falsity of the conclusion. This is always true. It is different when the inference is only probable, which would be the case in induction and hypothesis. It is by no means follow that because the truth of a certain premise would render the truth of a conclusion probable, therefore the falsity of the conclusion renders the falsity of the premise probable. At least this is only true, as we have seen in the former paper, which we didn't read, but when the word probable is used in one sense in the antecedent and another in the consequent. So basically, this whole section is to say, kind of in a way that can seem aggravating, being like, well, you can do all of these things. You can find a syllogistic form to put inductive and hypothetical inferences in. But if you do that, actually, that's not very useful, because there are certain kinds of things that would follow from those syllogistic forms that probably will not apply to probable inferences. So probable inference may not be best represented by syllogistic form. It's kind of what he's arguing here at some length, because he doesn't think that syllogisms are useless. He thinks that they're useful. They show you some things, but they can also disguise things. And again, you have to imagine that pretty much everybody thought for a long time that the only way things could be logical is if they were put in syllogistic form. That's the only way things could be logical for a lot of people. Okay, section 3. A certain anonymous writing is upon a torn piece of paper. Ooh, mysterious. Kind of like an Edgar Allan Poe story. It is suspected that the author is a certain person. I just watched a Columbo episode where this was like the premise of it, so maybe that's why it seems like intriguing to me. Like intrigue. His desk, to which only he has access, is searched, and in it is found a piece of paper, the torn edge of which exactly fits, in all its irregularities, that of the paper in question. Aha! The aha erlebnis. Aha, that must be the case. It must have come from that. Well, really, it is a fair hypothetic inference that the suspected man was actually the author. So Sherlock Holmes always calls these moments in his detective stories deductions, but Sherlock Holmes is wrong. These are not deductions. These are hypotheses. The ground of this inference, evidently, is that two torn pieces of paper are extremely unlikely to fit together by accident. That's the rule. That's the rule. Hold on one second. I think I might have to leave because something is happening earlier than I thought it was, which is okay. But I might come back and finish this later. We'll see based on the response that I get. Therefore, of a great number of inferences of this sort, but a very small proportion would be deceptive. The analogy, so, it's how often it'd be like, actually, these pieces of paper were torn perfectly from different pieces of paper to fit. It's just boggles the mind. That would never happen, right? That's astronomically unlikely to happen. But really, it's still not a deductive certainty. It's a hypothetical inference based on pretty good odds. The analogy of hypothesis with induction is so strong that some logicians have confounded them, meaning made them the same thing. Hypothesis has been called an induction of characters. And here he's going to use the term characters a lot. And characters means something like properties, the characters of things. Being like, honey is kind of translucent and yellowish. Okay, I'm gonna have to lose it. So I'm gonna finish this paragraph and then I'm gonna come back later. Oh well, it's unfortunate that it happened this way, but sometimes life is like that. But then I'll come back and I'll try to finish it before the Super Bowl. But if you're here with me, I'm sorry that I'll have to stop, but I'll come back. I'll let you know. If you subscribe, if you like or whatever, follow me, you'll get the announcement when I come back online. If the hypothesis were nothing but an induction, all that we should be justified in concluding in the example above would be that two pieces of paper which matched in such irregularities as have been examined would be found to match in other, say, slighter irregularities. The inference from the shape of the paper to its ownership is precisely what distinguishes hypothesis from induction and makes it a bolder and more perilous step. I mean, it doesn't seem like a very perilous step here, but there are going to be other cases where it would be. And so he took one that would show you why you might confuse hypothesis and induction. Like it seems very, very likely, but just because a probable inference is likely doesn't tell you whether it's hypothesis or induction. So you're going to go further into that. But for now, thanks for coming to the stream. I'm going to pause it, and I should be back, I would say, in like less than half an hour. So if you want to stick around and hear the rest of this, please come back. Otherwise, thanks for coming, and then I'll see you next time.